Hey, everybody. Welcome to a special episode of Kentucky Commons Podcast. As a part of Louisville Beer Week this year, we held a few panel discussions around town, and we are very happy to bring one of those conversations to you now. This is our From Stave to Glass Barrel panel discussion, centered around all the ways that liquids such as wine, beer, bourbon, or otherwise interacts with the wood that holds it to age and mature. We had guests from the spirits world, from the beer world, and from the barrel world as well.
In my old Kentucky home. Kentucky.
All right, guys, let's actually get this started tonight. Thank you so much for being here tonight at Third Turn Brewing at the next door barrel room. We have a great panel tonight that we're really excited about. If you haven't already gotten a drink, please do so. We got the bar open, and we also have some goodies here as well, too. Four Pegs has some barbecue, as we're talking about over here. It's the man meal of the night, the meaty man meal. Thank you for that tagline. I'm going to introduce you all to Jessica Adkins from H&A Barrel Management, and then she can help us introduce our panelists. Again, thank you so much for being here. Let's have some fun.
All right. So I'm hella nervous because this is the first time I've moderated a panel, so I'm going to do my best. I'm Jessica. I'm with H&A Barrel Management. I have been working in the used barrel, finishing barrel sector since July 1st of 2020. So I was in the spirits industry. I worked in bourbon, and then I got thrown into like this barrel industry. And so I worked for a French company selling wine cask. And being a Kentucky girl, I'm like, I can't pronounce half of these names. I don't know what I'm selling. So it was a lot of like learning what was in my barrels, but also how to use barrels, how they work with distilleries, how they work with finishing. And so, yeah, I've been able to work with everyone on this panel in some capacity. And that's why like I really, truly love what I do, because I don't get to just work with like one place. I get to work a lot with everyone, and it's very collaborative. And we're taking wood. I'm always like, I feel like Pocahontas because I get to work with wood and trees and recycle them and reuse them and do collaborations. So I'm going to let everyone introduce themselves and share a little bit about what you guys are doing, what you're proud of, related to barrels, finishing new barrels, used barrels. Jackie.
Hi. Okay. Is my microphone working? Yeah? Okay, cool. I'm Jackie Zykan. I am currently one of the owners and master blender for Hidden Barn Whiskey. Prior to that, I was master taster for Old Forester Bourbon for 7 years. I never know what to say. I just do things. I do work with Jess quite a bit. We do get our Madeira casks through you, plus anything else that I can't talk about yet that is to come. But and on the side, I also own an oak-based fragrance brand called Odu Oak. Cheeky as hell. But yeah, outside of that, I just do independent consulting, left, right, and wherever, doing different blends for brands now. And I'm not from Kentucky. I've been here about 15 years, though. Drank enough whiskey to be considered a Kentuckian at this point, I guess. But here we are. I don't know. What else does one say?
I think you covered it.
Cool.
Yeah.
Go for it.
All right. My name's Andrew Wiehebrink. I'm the Director of Research and Innovation for Independent Stave Company. My job, kind of twofold. Half of it is essentially just pure research in the lab, doing barrel experiments. The other half is we work with a number of different distilleries, breweries, to develop new products. So like Maker's Mark Wood Finishing Series is a project that I've been directly involved with for the past 8 years. Just a lot of the LTOs that you see on the shelf for these bigger distilleries, the easiest thing to do is switch up their wood policy as opposed to changing mash bills, distillation proofs, spots in the warehouse, that kind of thing. So we get asked to help out on a lot of that kind of stuff. And I've been doing that for 8 years now. Before that, I was a mechanical engineer, and that's why I'm not doing that anymore. It was extremely boring. So a little about me.
Good evening. How we doing? How's my mic? Not working?
You got to get all up in it.
Keep talking? All right. I'm going to keep talking. What up? I'm Marty Scott, Revolution Brewing, Chicago. I'm the barrel program manager. Been there 14 years now. I'm the only person who's ever run the program. And because my father's from Louisville, I've always had an affinity for bourbon and for oak, especially in beer and in beverage. So we really don't like to step too much on the characteristics of wood and bourbon that we get into our beer. There it is. Hey, how we doing, everybody? We've got some of those beers kind of like barrel focused. Even when we do adjuncting coffee, there's even a tropical fruit English barley wine that we brought tonight that's still mostly about the barrel. It was kind of a challenge brought down from some of our marketing folks, but that's kind of our MO there. On the side, I'm happy to announce I'm just picked up in Indianapolis on my way down here today the first batch of business cards for my new consulting LLC, Barrel Ponics, and I'll be focusing. I'm staying with Revolution, but I'll be focusing on helping younger brewers establish, economize, weaponize their barrel programs. Networking with French oak suppliers, bourbon barrel suppliers. I work with my now Louisville-based barrel supplier, Midwest Barrel Company, as a consultant for them. I just got my French oak supplier from Paso Robles, California, to sign on as well. I'll be hosting the FOBAB, or the Festival of Wood and Barrel Aged Beer. Festival of Wood and Barrel Aged Beer in Chicago. I'll be hosting the awards ceremony about 2 weeks from now, and the next day I'll be heading out to Paso Robles, California to crush some grapes for harvest this year. I spent a month out there at Herman Story Wines last year. I love wine, love beer. In Illinois, it's legal, so at home I grow dope too. I get invited back to a lot of parties that I attend, but it's illegal here, so I didn't bring any, so don't ask me. And yeah, that's what I do.
Awesome. Roger Huff. I'm the owner of Gallant Fox Brewing Company. Previous, when we opened back in 2020, was one of the two brewers that we had with my other partner. So grew up here in Louisville, grew up in the home brewing community here. So know a lot of people that are here tonight through that. And know John, obviously, through that as well. We've kind of come a long way. So we have two locations, one directly in Louisville that opened a month into the pandemic. So really good business planning, obviously, for home brewers, you could tell. And then we opened our second location in Mount Washington, not too far from here, in December of this last year. As Kentucky, both of me and my partner as Kentucky boys focus on Kentucky beer, Kentucky barrel aging, as well as Kentucky bourbon. So we have large 200 plus bourbons at the Louisville location, 350 at the Mount Washington location, with both of having curated vintage collections. And really excited to be on the panel tonight. We've been doing a lot over the last couple of years with barrel experimentation, recently partnering with Yellowstone Bourbon and the Fraser History Museum on a project with some barrel aging that they had. Excited about our new partnership with being Bernheim Forest's official brewery partner. So not just doing stuff with barrels, but doing stuff with foraging in the beers that we do. So recently released a collab with Bernheim that had lemon balm and Appalachian mountain mint. And then this past week we released a beer called Berlinerheim. It's a Berliner Weiss that we did with autumn olive and a little bit of raspberry. So we're trying to get invasive species out of the forest and also showcase those things as we can to people. So a shameless plug for Louisville Beer Week. We're also hosting My Morning Beer Fest Saturday morning at our distribution warehouse on Spring Street. So if you like breakfast themed beers and getting drunk at 9 a.m., come out.
And so, is this on? Nope. Can you hear me?
Just yell.
Okay. We also have some celebrities in the room. We have Kyle Henderson, who I feel like the Hendersons were the first. Angel's Envy was the first distillery to make finishing barrels and a barrel finish part of their home brand lineup. And then we have Zach Zimlick, who's my fiance, who has a barrel cooperage. So I am going to open it up later for any kind of questions. I feel like between everybody here, if there's any questions, surely we can get them answered in the room. Okay, so I was going to start with something easy. I didn't know who was going to be here as far as what you guys wanted to know, if it was geeks, if it was nerds, if it was people just wanting to hear about barrel finishing. So I was going to do a little bit of everything. First things first, what roles do barrels play in what you guys do on a daily basis? And then what barrels have you worked with that you particularly like or have had success with? Roger?
I'll start. We'll go backwards this time. Right?
We'll go backwards.
So at Gallant Fox, we have 24 taps at our Louisville location, 28 taps in Mount Washington. And we try to keep at minimum 2 to 3 taps dedicated to barrel aged beers. We like to focus on, as you know, we don't, if you've been to either of our tap rooms, we don't like to have core beers like a lot of other places. So we continuously rotate the beers that come on. And we like to rotate those. So we just did a Baltic Porter and an Elijah Craig barrel. We did a Yellowstone Imperial Brown Ale and a Yellowstone barrel. So we try to, the best we can, we try to extract the same tasting notes from the barrel that you would get as a distiller. So when we had our event at the Fraser and you heard Yellowstone talking about those tasting notes, the same caramels, the same things that he wants, I want a beer that complements those flavors. And I'd say that the thing I've had the most fun working with over the last few years of us being open, we do an annual release in February of a beer called Jamborana. It is a ode of everything we do is an ode to the 80s or 90s because we're 80s and 90s kids and that's where we grew up. So this is an NBA Jam themed beer and we do it in Amberana barrel. So we like to utilize the Amberana spirals in the bright tank, which give a little bit of a cinnamon taste to the beer. It's very potent. It ages very quick. The flavor imparts very quickly and we do that with raspberries and it's an imperial milk stout. So we try to have fun. We try to complement. And I've really liked working with the different finishing barrels that I think have become so important in the bourbon community recently as a lot of brands have tried to differentiate themselves by the different finishes that they've had. I think a few years ago, you'd see a lot of staple bourbons, and now you see brands like 1792 that have multiple different finishes. You're seeing Weller, a Buffalo Trace product, which is now they're even branching out into those things. So I think those things have definitely proliferated into the beer community as well.
Good answer.
Thanks.
I also brought an Amberana beer. It's called Dread and Breakfast, and I'm not even going to be here for the frickin' breakfast party. But I brought enough that there should be some left over for it. But yeah, we use the Amberana. In this case, we just got 2 Amberana barrels. We just ordered a whole bunch more. As Roger said, they're hugely active, very exciting things. If we're getting ready to dispense this, this was a 40-barrel blend. All 40 barrels were stout, barley wine, rye wine, Scotch ale. It's a big blend meant to give as many breakfast flavors as possible. But everything was in a bourbon barrel. Some things were also in wine barrels. Some things also got additional French oak. Some things, and then 2 out of the 40 bourbon barrels also got finished for a grand total like 2.5 months in Amberana. And again, this is called Dread and Breakfast. Just a playful little thing that we finish it with a little bit of coffee over the top post aging. But while they're pouring that, as far as what other barrels work for us, I get all my barrels or almost all my barrels from Midwest Barrel Company. They used to be out of Lincoln, Nebraska. They've just relocated here to Louisville. Dr. Ben Los started his company with an order from Revolution. He hit me up for like a dozen or so Buffalo Trace barrels right at the time that I was firing another supplier. And I said, sure, get me 50. And he shit his pants and then found 50 Buffalo Trace barrels and got them on a truck to me and started his business. He'll probably, give more detail than that. Sorry, been any inaccuracy there. But again, we love barrel-centric everything, and we're trying to move the ball forward, move the science, at least in the brewing world, of how to handle beer in barrels. And I'll get into my holy trinity of extraction, oxidation, and evaporative concentration. It's way different on beer with all of its sugar content than it is in wine, than it is with spirits. So we kind of have this other dimension that we're playing with, and also concentrating through evaporation. We just nerd out on that confluence. So to us, there's a great use for young, unsexy barrels that may have only seen bourbon for 4 years. Those barrels have a lot more story to tell, and they have a beautiful application. They've got a perfect application. But also, if somebody tries to sell you a Pappy Van Winkle barrel, it's hard to tell the owner that you said no. Just because it's an old dead ass spent barrel that's not sloshing around with Pappy, and that barrel's told its story. So that's a kind of long meandering version of our philosophy with barrels. But we love any barrel that doesn't leak and doesn't infect the beer. There's a use for that barrel, and it's up to us to turn those barrels into rock stars.
What were the two questions?
So Andrew has been super important to me over the last 3 years. When I first started, because he lives so close, I'm like, Andrew, have you experimented with this? Have you experimented with this? And then I had some acacia oak, and I'm like, what does this taste like? And he's like, I'm sure I have some that I've experimented with. I attended his seminar at a Moonshine University just to learn about the younger barrels and the flavors that are left and that kind of thing. So my question was, I guess for you, what barrels have you experimented with? But you're doing a lot. But also, what barrels do you think are overrated?
Well, as far as barrels that we're experimenting with, for me, the most interesting thing is I work with mostly new oak the whole time. So that gets kind of boring after a while. So what's most interesting to me are the things that you can do, the things that we're studying that you do with these new barrels. So for instance, at any given time, we have about 4,000 barrels in experiment all over the world. And I find that the most interesting experiments are the ones that aren't necessarily, talking about how does char 1 differ from char 4. But for instance, we have barrels in Scotland containing the exact same whiskey as barrels that are aging in Texas. That's a really cool experiment. We're studying distillation proof. We're studying entry proof. We're studying what happens when you put barrels at the first floor of a warehouse versus the 9th story of a warehouse. We're studying what happens when you put 2 different whiskeys with different yeast strains in different or identical char 4 barrels. So even though we're not varying up the heat treatment or the oak species too much, I find that those little variations that you do kind of post distillation and even during distillation have been the most fascinating experiments. We're also working with a lot of flavors that are outside of oak. So we've tested 45 different exotic wood species. We've smoked barrels with agave plants. Just to see what kind of flavor that would lend to a finishing application for a tequila. So really, my job right now is studying flavor outside of oak and really, really learning about some of the kind of environmental influence. And as far as the most overrated barrel, char 4. The most popular barrel is the most overrated. Most people don't know that a char 1, if you were to age a char 1 next to a char 4 for 4 years, you would find that the char 1 has more color after 4 years. It has more flavor after 4 years. It's much sweeter. And it's about 18 months ahead of the char 4 in terms of overall extractive concentration. So char 4 is a little bit overrated in that sense.
Unless you're aging for a long time, isn't?
Yeah, I mean, it does. The char 4, one of the good things about it does create a really, really nice environment for micro-oxygenation. So once you start getting into the latter years of maturation, 8 to 12 years where things can become over-oaked, the lack of extractive concentration in char 4 plus the micro-oxidative environment does tend to help out barrels that are aging a little bit longer.
And on the Amburana note, so I think it works really well in beer. You had some interesting insights on bourbon, which bourbons worked with Amburana and what didn't so much.
Yeah, we tried 3 different types of whiskeys with Amburana. We tried a malt whiskey, American single malt, just kind of a standard bourbon, and then kind of a standard rye. In all honesty, I thought that the Amburana was overpowering for every single one of them. It's just not my forte. I thought it was very, very over. When you do the entire barrel, it is a whole lot. But it did have some interesting applications with malt whiskey. So if anybody here has a chance to finish something in a malt or an Amburana barrel that's had malt whiskey into it, I think you would find the results pretty pleasing.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I agree with you 100% on that. And that's been a very polarizing thing. I'm not sure what to add to this because my job really comes in post distillation, right? I'm given a certain set of paints to paint with, and I'm not the one laying the juice down in the first place. I am working across different producers, and obviously having spent so much time at Brown-Forman, it's a Brown-Forman barrel across the board, no matter what. You're lovely. Char number 4. So endearing. But nonetheless, no, it's okay. No harm, no foul. Like, it is what it is. But it's certainly interesting. But is it okay if I just go rogue and like start asking him questions? Yeah. Okay, cool. When you say you're laying down 2 identical Char number 4 barrels, am I allowed to cuss? Mm-hmm. How the fuck are you making 2 identical barrels ever?
So I just wrote a blog post about this. I don't know if it's released yet, but it was basically, the title was called Esters and Esterification, the Unsung Heroes of a Single Barrel Program. In reality, when you do create 2 barrels, especially Char 4 barrels, they're the most consistent barrels you can create. The manufacturing process is really repeatable, especially if you're automated the way that ISC is. Really, the only differences you get post-charring are going to be different wood densities. And I can tell you that the variation in flavor from different wood densities, the way that I look at it is, if you were in Best Buy, you looked at a really, really shitty TV next to a really, really nice TV. You can tell the differences. You put those TVs in 2 different rooms, it's going to be really, really difficult to tell the difference. So the variations that you get from wood have what I would consider a minimal flavor impact, especially when you compare it to things like toasting and charring. Now, esterification is a process that's not static nor linear. So I think when you start getting headspace into the barrels and you start getting esterification, trans-esterification, you start getting all these oxidative processes, I think that's really where barrel differentiation starts to take place. And you can start to get these, 2 Char 4 barrels that taste totally different from one another, not because they've necessarily been charred differently or made differently. They might have different trees that make up the wood, but again, those flavor differences are minimal. I think it's really about the oxidative processes that take place.
No, and I'm glad that you bring that up because I think from a bourbon lens, I know we're at a beer event, but my world is the bourbon world. For the most part, generalized statement here, everybody leans into, esters. Well, that's coming from depending on whatever yeast you're using, and they leave it at that. But they're not realizing the development that's taking place inside the barrel based on the wood in and of itself. And that's a huge, huge piece of it. So I'm glad that you said that. Yeah.
If you guys, we're friends now. Well, if you go to ISC, shameless plug again. If you go to iscbarrels.com and check out the blog, I don't think they've approved the blog post yet, but hopefully next week there will be a lot of information on this topic, and I actually cite some really, really cool sources from Seagram. As you know, they did a lot of really, really good work back in the 50s that kind of explains these variations that you get with seemingly or what should be identical barrels.
Thank you. Okay, so learning from our past mistakes, what barrels have you used or worked with that you would not use again, or any issues that have come up that you could share that might be helpful for anybody listening to this?
I have a really short answer for this one. So we, like I said, we ordered about 35 different types of woods. I didn't do any checking into them, but after we pretty much got the whiskey into them, we got the whiskey out, we tasted them. One whiskey was actually rested on wood that was made from a poisonous wood that's in Australia called mulga wood. So that is one that I do not recommend using. People actually used to tip their darts with the oil from this wood to make poison darts. That's a bad one. But other than that, everything else has been pretty good.
Yeah, I think the only barrel that I think that we just didn't like any of the flavors that it imparted on our beer was, and this may be just because we're from Kentucky, is a Scotch barrel. We did a couple of different versions of a beer, one of which was a Rausch beer that was a smoky beer that we thought would impart a lot of great flavors that would complement the Scotch. And then we laid down our basic, 12% imperial stout that goes into a lot of the barrels that we age. And nothing that came out of any of the barrels that we put down for Scotch tasted at all good. So I think that has a little bit to do with the flavor profile that we like as just Kentucky guys, right? Like we love to put big barrel aged stouts into Kentucky bourbon barrels, but I also don't like Scotch either. So maybe it was a poor experiment.
Hard to talk about specific barrels without heaping dirt on a company unfairly. But I'd say most Caribbean rum barrels, which have seen their more than their fair share of whiskey, and then the ocean, and then way too much rum, and then way too much ocean, and then they come back to us and they've got no character left whatsoever. And especially young brewers who are excited about the flavor profiles of rum. They wind up with, super leaky barrels that have absolutely no oak whatsoever to contribute. That's always a disappointment. Yeah. You still get to put rum on the label, and you're going to sell a little bit of beer just by what you put on the label, but you're going to sell less beer next time if you sell a shitty product this time. Rum barrels, beware, as well as, any kind of barrel for beer. If you're looking for oak, especially, you need to be looking for barrels that still have some life in them, some story to tell. And that's where I love getting involved with blending, because you can get some of these nuances from these more challenging and tired barrels if you want a unique spirit profile. But it should always be anchored, balanced with something that And that's why we love to blend everything with Willet barrels, Wild Turkey barrels, Buffalo Trace barrels. Get those wacky barrels involved if you want, but keep it a little closer to home and keep the flavor and aroma profile where people expect it. So don't get too wacky. Make one barrel at a time if you're going to sell it on draft, but be ready to blend the rest of that, couple kegs into a much larger batch when it doesn't move in your tap room.
Yeah. I always say barrels are like stepchildren, like used barrels. Like you get them used. They could have some, like not our barrels, H&A barrels are coming direct from the wineries, but they have issues. Like sometimes they have issues and you're like, why don't you just freaking behave? Like I did everything right. Why don't you behave? And some of those things are like, if I'm going to hit on sulfur, every winery has a sulfur program. Sulfur is like a gas they put inside of a barrel at a winery to keep bacteria from growing. Some wineries use sulfur programs more than others. But sometimes you're like, we did everything right. Like this winery doesn't use a sulfur program. We've rinsed the barrel. We've done this. We didn't add tablets. And then you get the barrel and down the road, it comes out with like a sulfur profile, which I think Kyle Henderson said that he had a single barrel that won an award or something that was like really sulfured. But most people don't like sulfur So anyway, I'm like, just behave, be good, do your job. But rum is especially like that, because if I do have to broker and they're not coming from wineries, rum is a battlefield.
Yeah, those barrels are beat up from the feet up.
And tequila.
Yeah, tequila as well.
Tequila.
Yeah, big time. I just got some Cruzan rum barrels. They were finishing barrels. They've only seen 1 year of rum, and the rum that they're seeing was already fully aged before that. Mm-hmm. I'm ecstatic to fill those when I get back later this week with some English barley wine, but it's still not going to be the entirety of the batch that's going into those barrels. It's just a micro lot for experimentation. We've got enough to do a release if it pans out, but we're going to blend it way down if it don't. And I had another thought. Maybe it'll come back to me later. I'll just interrupt somebody when it comes back.
Fine.
Don't worry.
That's fine. You can interrupt me. That's cool. Permission granted. I don't know. With Hidden Barn, we've only done one finishing product, right? And that's Madeira cask finish. And the whole reason for that wasn't just, we happen to have access to Madeira cask. It was that the base spirit coming out of Neely complemented that. I don't think that this free-for-all approach of just, this is the hot thing to finish it in, so just throw it in there and it will expect it to taste good ever works. You have to be very, very prescriptive about it. You have to keep in mind what's actually going into it in the first place and how that's going to work with the flavor profile. Not everything is going to taste good with every single finish on it. The Neely juice, which this would be a great time for you to pour some of this liquid. So pour it. Great. Because you guys are thirsty, right? I mean, everyone's kind of got a drink, but let's drink some bourbon right now. Yes. Neely's making things a little bit differently out there. He's up in Sparta, Kentucky, up by that NASCAR track. His mash bill on this is 70-20-10, so 70 corn, 20 rye, and 10 malted barley. But he's using wild yeast that he's actually capturing in a bucket. He hangs out by a tree in Appalachia. He refreshes that every year. So you get some unexpected flavor profiles that the bourbon community has been kind of like, they love it or they hate it because it doesn't taste like everything coming out of the big box producers. Hidden Barn has some funky flavor profile to it, but that's why we do what we do, because bourbon can also taste like this. So this actually has, that you guys are about to get a sample. This is a single barrel. The barrel itself came from the Zach cooperage. Zach, there you go. Hey. With 2-year seasoned oak going into that. But it's all pot still. He's got cypress fermentation tanks out there. Like I said, wild yeast. And it's kind of a candy store out there for someone like me that wants to find diversity in a warehouse to play around with. But the Neely stuff works very well with the Madeira. It's got some really great nutty undertones. Always has a really nice apricot note to it, which works really well in that as well. So you guys will have this coming around to you, but I can't say that there's anything that like has gone wrong because we've done such limited things. And at Brown Foreman, it took 37 people to say yes to something if I was able to do anything anyways. So there's a reason we're not there anymore. But nonetheless, probably going to get in trouble for giving away the Bush Beans secret here. But as far as R&D goes, when you're looking to mass produce something at a place such as that, they do come up with a system of how can we estimate what this might potentially taste like just for shits and grins. And it was always add 5% of whatever it is you were going to finish it in. So if you were going to finish it in a Madeira cask, they would literally just add 5% to the base spirit and go, well, this is what it might taste like. There are so many elements of that process. I'm hitting you like, am I wrong? There's so many elements of that process you're missing out on by just adding fresh Madeira to a bunch of whiskey and going, well, this is what it might be like. So it's really kind of a trial and error process on the front end, but I don't know. When we come into considering other finishing projects, it has to come down to what is the base spirit we're dealing with first. The same way that y'all would be, what beer is going to work best with the flavor profile of that. Not everything is going to taste good in a Scotch barrel, as you said down there, whether you like Scotch or not. The only Louisvillian at the table that pronounces it Louisville, which I find funny, but nonetheless, I'm not up here for information. I'm just up here to give everybody shit today, I guess. But nonetheless, you guys are going to get this sample passed around. This is, what's the proof on that? I grabbed it out of my garage. I just grabbed whatever bottle I could find. 108. 108. Okay. So this hasn't been filtered. It's just coming straight out of barrel to bottle. I hope you enjoy it. If you don't, that's cool too. Don't drink it. That's fine. But this hasn't been finished in anything other than a brand new oak barrel. What I have found though, with some of these other rando contracts that I've done for consulting on the side is that if the goal is that you want to add a rum note, they're just getting a new barrel and seasoning it themselves with rum. You take all the sexy romanticism out of it that way, but you're going to get the rum flavor and you're still going to get a lot of the oak influence that way. Or if you know what I mean? They're just making their own seasoning barrels where it's not some, sorry, I know this is probably going to like cut into the business I do with you because I buy finishing barrels from you, but it's a thing. I don't know, man. Programs? Yeah, I mean, like if you want a barrel and you want to impart a flavor onto something, you just season the barrel with said flavor to get a more pure example of what that would be.
Exactly.
We have at H&A, we have a seasoning program for our port, Madeira, and our sherry, because those barrels don't always exist in the quantities for the demand that we have. So if you need thousands and thousands of, let's say, port barrels, we take former red wine casks that have been used for, 4 or 5 times. The oak is pretty neutral. Clean it out, do the whole thing, and send it to some port partners in Portugal who have their older ports that have been continue to age, and they will put their port in there for a year to 18 months, and then we will send them a new batch of barrels, and we take their port seasoned barrels. That way you can reproduce quantity, scalable, but it's been seasoned. There are really old port barrels, but they're going to be very, very expensive. They're going to fall apart when you get them. So it's just about being able to reproduce something scalable. And there are barrels that are really, really old and valuable, and that we will. I've had $1,000 casks before that, or as old as me. So yeah, there are some of those, but they're they're fewer between.
So you actually reminded me of something that didn't work, which I think everybody here would kind of find interesting when you mentioned Scotch. So we recently released a new line of barrels, which we call our small batch smoked series. And so we smoke barrels with apple wood, we smoke barrels with hickory wood and maple wood. The differentiation that you get from smoking with different hardwoods was not good at all. We actually had to differentiate the barrels just by changing the toast profile. We also have a line of peat smoked barrels, and the differentiation you get from smoking with peat is astounding. So we flew in peat from like the Scottish Highlands. We flew in peat from Ireland. We flew in peat from Washington here in the United States. And this is what I was getting to. Even Kentucky has peat bogs. I don't know if everybody's aware of this, but we do have a lot of coal. I don't know what's in the dirt here, but it turned the entire barrel yellow and put off the most awful smell. So if anybody tries to sell you a Kentucky peated barrel, or if anybody tries to sell you Kentucky peat anything, run as fast as you can, because I can guarantee you it's probably not safe.
I was wondering how that turned out. I remember you doing that with
Yeah,
me.
like a fart in a phone booth. It didn't work.
Okay, so I do want to get into blending, but first I just want to ask, as far as how long you're aging for, because I have several different clients. Some of them are like, oh, we age 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 6 weeks. Sometimes people are pressed for money and they're just like, this is the flavor I want, or they get really nervous that it's going to be like over flavored. So do you guys have a standard of how long you are finishing for or using a barrel for, or is it different for every release?
So I would say that we haven't released anything unless it's set in a barrel for 6 months. I still think that's not enough. For beer, I think that's not enough time. We would prefer for everything to set in wood for at least 12 months. I think that you do get to a point, we've released some, like they've all said, it depends on the barrel that you have, right? When we did Amberana introduction into our beer, Amberana sets on our beer, and we're doing much smaller batches than Revolution's doing, but Amberana sets on our beer. It sets in staves or in spirals in our bright tank, and we taste it intraday. So this is something that we taste multiple times a day because it imparts our small batches, our 10 to 20 barrel batches of beer so quickly. Like you heard, like obviously it can get out of control very quickly, like you heard. So, but for most bourbon barrels, the things that we're getting are 4 char. So we know that it has to set for a little while to impart that flavor, right? If we were getting stuff that was a little bit different, that would also be a different story. But 12 months, we've had some great beers that come out at 6 months, but the taste, similar to what you tasted with Revolution, that taste takes a while. And it takes, like you said, it takes blending as well, right? Because barrels are going to come out and they're going to have different characteristics based on all of the things that the barrel brokers here have talked about.
Going down to you. I think I'm without a whiskey sample. I'm not going to speak until I have one. Thank you. Everyone's still good? Everyone's still got one? All right, great. Revolution, blending the aging time isn't just about the barrels. Again, I talked about, you have oxidation, you have evaporative concentration. That's not unique just to the beer world. Our sugar concentration is. And so many of our beers, when you're pushing 15, 16, 17, 18 ABV in an English style barrel aged beer, the way you balance that intensity of flavor and all that hydrophobia of the oak tannin, hopefully, and certainly the alcohol, is with sugar. If you made a 1 or 2 Plato or Brix finishing beer that was 18 ABV, nobody would like it. So when we're flirting with these really heady ABVs for beer, we have to chase that with sugar. There's got to be that balance. So it's that ridiculous sometimes sugar concentration that can dictate aging times as well. We like to age our sweet components very long because we like to get the oxidation on those sugars where they can actually turn bready maltiness into fruity maltiness and other things, esterification as well. But we also have, we've got limited space in our barrel stacks. We're in Chicago. We've got to pay these barrels have to pay rent. So we don't want to just age everything for 5 years. Some things might only age for 6 to 12 weeks. Now we don't draw it up like that, but we intentionally make a very sweet and a very dry and sometimes the larger releases, many gray areas between, where we can weaponize the impact of oxidation on sugar to drive fruity maltiness. And we'll do that with young barrels that we're going to extract a lot of oak from that long aging. Conversely, we don't want to release big, sweet, sticky beers. We want to be balanced, nuanced, traditional. So we make a smaller, drier batch that we age a little bit more surgically in a very old whiskey barrel, where the only whiskey you're going to get, or the only wood you're going to get from that barrel, is from whatever whiskey is left in that barrel. That extraction, pretty quick, as opposed to extracting years and years of oak, which the whiskey's already done in an old barrel. In a new barrel, it's still there. So we split it up. So we've got most of our beers, especially I think most of our best beers, are anywhere from the youngest, driest components in very old whiskey barrels. Might only be in there for a handful of weeks or months if we had a shortage of yeast and we couldn't brew in time, and we kick that can. We're a production brewery. We've got production schedules to keep, and we're an IPA factory first and foremost, by the way. This is like a hobby for Revolution. So in our best blends, maybe a couple of months in barrels, in old barrels, and up to 5 years aging in barrels for our sweeter components and our younger barrels. And then we just pull them together and we get the right amount of, oxidation and extraction and oak and all that kind of stuff. We don't want just bready maltiness. You don't want just the biscuit, and you don't want to over age it and over oxidize and get just jam. What you want is jam on the biscuit. Right? So it's almost, for us, it's almost like a lambic or like a goose production, where you have a 1, 2, and 3 year sour, where you blend together and you have the concentration, oxidation, oak extraction, and everything. But you also have the younger beer to balance it out. And you have a little bit of everything to give you a complex and balanced product. So that's how we age, is anywhere from 3 weeks to 5 years. And both of those beers can go, or both of those barrels can go into the same beer, no problem, and often do.
I'm not a producer, so I don't really have a whole lot of insight.
You've done experiments.
Yeah, we've done probably 5 or 6 different experiments with new oak and beer. About half of those have been with barrel alternatives. I don't know if you guys are familiar with what that means. I've heard we talk about some spiles or some spirals, tank staves, that kind of thing. With the barrel, we've gone out 24 months in experimentation, and we've did another experiment where we went out, I think, like 3 or 4 months. And I tend to agree with you. The 3 or 4 month the new oak, while it did impart some decent flavors, the complexity that it imparted was not, in my opinion, very beneficial, especially when you compare it to the price of a $800 French oak barrel. I guess an interesting point would be the alternatives, like the tank staves and the spirals. The producers that I've worked with or experimented with seem to find the flavor development from those, from a wood aspect, a little bit more favorable than the barrel. Now, that's not including oxidative process development, that kind of stuff. But as far as just like wood flavor goes, the experiments that I've done, it seems that you get a little bit more flavor control, a little bit better risk management, and a little bit more precise flavor development with the actual tank staves, as opposed to going with the actual barrel. I'm not saying that's an indicative of overall quality. I'm just saying, as far as imparting barrel flavor, that seems to happen pretty quick. But that's kind of my input there.
Yeah. So again, with the Hidden Barn stuff, we've only done the Madeira, but it's been a 6 to 8 month finishing process. And that's an entry into that at about 110 proof. But it just depends. And I start tasting it about 3 months and taste it every month after that until it kind of hits its sweet spot. And it just depends what season you start, to be honest with you. If I start it in November, obviously it's going to take a little bit longer because those barrels are going to sit a little bit chilly. So that has a lot to do with it.
Yeah, and we don't have to pour this right now, but I did bring 2 samples from Doc Swinson. They are a blending house in Washington, really cool people. And so he wrote me a letter. So one of them, they're both Muscatel. It's the same barrel. One was aged at 6 weeks, and it's just for sample purposes. And then the one they released is 6 months aged. And so he's like, Jessica, I've included a 750 ml of our bourbon finished in your Muscatel cask. One of them is a blend of 3 to 4 weeks old, and the other is approximately 6 months. The proofs are almost identical. You can tell the difference between the two, as one in the cask longer over the summer are richer and more rounded. Also included some other bottles, but you guys didn't get those. Never mind. So that's another thing that I've always noticed is over the summer, what does it do? In Washington, when I was there, they had larger format cask. They weren't using small traditional barrels. They were using larger format cask in cooler weather and longer aging. It was just so beautiful. It was this is so good. The finish was so rounded and delicious. So yeah. Okay. I do. Before we keep going, I think there's only 10 or 15 minutes. Do anybody have any questions? I don't want to keep us rambling before anybody gets to asking questions when they come here for.
Yeah, we just bought 20 cruising rums. Do you know which rums they put in those? No idea. They look good though. Oh, really? We're gonna have a chat after this.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, I don't know, but I fell in love with the first time I had a young barrel that had old whiskey in it was a Woodford Double Oak. The first 20 of those barrels off the truck were fantastic. They were super tight, and they blew my mind because they were the best of both worlds. It was really, really, the whiskey in those barrels has seen the first year out of 2 different barrels. If it only had the first year out of 2 barrels, it'd be pretty damn oaky. But that finishing barrel is super young, so you can age in it a long time. You can get really oaky whiskey, a lot of oak concentration, nice tight barrel, limiting the evaporative concentration, limiting the oxidation, great extract flavors. The next 20 barrels on the truck at the time that I bought them 10 years ago were emptied weeks before that. The next 20 barrels off the truck were emptied weeks before that. They were filling the trailer, as they emptied, but they weren't filling a trailer at a time. By the time we got to filling those last couple of barrels, they were more like colanders than brick shit houses. So it was kind of a mixed bag. And, I got sick of that mixed bag and I stopped ordering those barrels. When I heard our supplier pitch me on the Cruzan rum barrels and tell me all the things that I like to hear about them, and then kind of negate all the things that I don't like to hear about rum barrels, I said, yeah, sure. Even if all we get is the oak, if we hate the whiskey or if we hate the rum, but we like the oak, we can blend that into how many different, we've got 1,500 oak barrels in our stacks at any time. We churn through about 700 to 800 of them every year. The rest of them age for multiple years. If all we get is some fuck off oaky English barley wine from this, great. It can be blended into stout. It can be blended anywhere. Or if it's great on its own, then we can showcase it on its own. But as to exactly what brands, it honestly was the first time I had ever heard of Cruzan rum when the barrels were pitched, but the description was enough for us to buy 20.
Any other questions? Yes.
Eventually, we're going to end up with something that's like Long Island iced tea. So is there anything tracking?
So he asked if there's any way to track any of the barrels so we don't end up with Long Island iced tea.
A wonderful goal, by the way, to not wind up with Long Island iced tea.
I will say for us personally, the barrels that I have, the wine cask, we operate as a leasing company. And so we lease these barrels to wineries. And as they come back in, we know where that barrel's been that year and we enter it into the system. So when I look at our system, I can say oh, this barrel's been used 3 times. It had this, this, and this in it. But that is not without fault. Barrels, there's a lot of barrels and sometimes they don't always tell you what was in them. I've had a lot of people approach me with ideas of QR codes and just different ways to track barrels. So I wish that we could track ours more. I don't know if you guys have any.
So barrel tracking is only going to be as good as the producers that it switches hands with, which most of our producers are pretty busy, and it gets hard to kind of get that standardized. But out of our new cooperage, we just started producing barrels December of last year. Every single barrel has laser engraved into the bung stave 2 QR codes that allow you to scan it and input whatever data into that QR code you want to. But again, you're going to rely on the next person putting their data in, the next person putting their data in. So it's something that producers are asking for, but they're going to have to do their part to do it as keep it up as well. But yeah, we've taken steps to make sure that they have the opportunity to do that.
I think also from a bourbon perspective, Kentucky does a great job just in how Kentucky and the federal government in general does a good job of how they identify what bourbon is, right? It's new white oak, right? So the benefit to breweries is that those barrels can't be used unless they're used in finishing post the initial release of bourbon, right? So for us, especially in Kentucky, we have distilleries calling us regularly, like, can we drop off something that we finished? We have an excess of barrels, which is nice. Not good for brokers, but very good for us here. And
perks of living in Kentucky.
Yeah, it's the perks of living in Kentucky. That doesn't happen to breweries in a lot of places, but there's a lot of young companies that are buying MGP bourbon and finishing it in other barrels. And a lot of Kentucky breweries, a lot of the breweries that you see in Louisville and throughout Kentucky are benefiting from that because there's a surplus of barrels here. But to that point, those barrels, the breweries aren't doing a good job of tracking what's going into those, right? So
yeah, it is hard to get producers to tell you. Any other questions? Yes.
You were describing the process of aging with staves and spirals. What exactly would that entail? Would that be like a new oak barrel that you just have to put certain types of staves in and then just let it sit for a while? Describe that process.
He's asking to describe the process of aging with staves and spirals. And you're asking Andrew.
Correct. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
With the
Yeah.
So generally what happens is Kentucky, well, I'll just use Kentucky producers as an example. So what they'll do is they'll age their whiskey in a standard char 4 barrel for 5 to 6 years. From that point on, it can really vary based on the, kind of the process of the distillery, how they introduce that new oak. Maker's Mark, they wanted to go all in. So what they do is they actually empty the barrel. They batch probably 15 to 20 barrels. They put new oak staves into the barrel. They just kind of put them on a ring, set them inside. They'll put the head back on, put the iron back on, and then they'll refill the barrel again. That's really the most difficult way to do things. There's applications where you can put basically oak on a rope through the bunghole. You can put cubes through the bunghole, and that's you get the same exact effect. The problem and the reason there were so many different formats was for Kentucky producers 8 years ago or 10 years ago when 46 started, you were allowed to, but like the thought of somebody putting cubes in their bourbon was not acceptable. Even the thought of somebody putting staves in the bourbon, like the Maker's 46, that was a pretty bold move on their part. Since then, I think the consumer has become much more educated and you can use different formats, but Maker's still kind of attributes to the old way of emptying the barrel, taking off the head, putting the new staves in, putting the head back on, filling the barrel back up. But I would say the majority of producers now empty their bourbon into a big stainless tank and then just hang staves in the tank. And I'm sure these guys could probably comment more about what happens on the beer world with regards to alternatives.
Yeah, I love the hybrid approach. I just made with a collaboration with Goldfinger Brewing in Downers Grove, Illinois, a French oaked Helles. It was just a 2-week or a 2-month stainless lagered German Helles, but we took single origin French oak and we put that into a keg. We filled a little bit of that beer into the keg, and we continued to lager 1 keg's worth on a shitload of fresh 3-year cured single origin French oak, and then blended that back into everything else. We didn't oxidize the Helles. We didn't infect the Helles. There was no evaporative concentration or anything. It's just a Helles dressed up with a tasteful amount of French oak. Now, that's a very specialized application of oak, isn't it? Like, you probably didn't think we were going to talk about French oak Helles tonight. but using an alternative and knowing what you can get away with there, dressing up a traditional German lager, the most traditional, the cleanest ever beer of all time, German Helles. And you can dress it up with French oak, but you don't have to ruin it by barrel aging it. With the barrel, you have oxidation, you have evaporation, you have these other things going on. But when you're adding alternatives in a stainless environment that you're otherwise controlling, you can get the extract without all the rest of the mucky muck that makes it taste more like a barley wine than a German lager. In other instances, I ordered a bunch of wine barrels from a famous winery out on the West Coast. And when they came in on a Friday afternoon, I was leaving the brewery and I saw that all these pallets of barrels had no bungs. They were open. They got shipped fucking open, unsealed. And I'm supposed to put an English barley wine in that on Monday. And fuck no. So the barrels go on racks. They get gassed. They get hot liquor and Cambia or SO2 and citric acid. And then they get more hot liquor, more gas. And I'm just trying to save the beer that's going in. Well, now you've taken all of the beauty from that barrel away. So I'll order more French oak. I love oak on a rope is something that I've done dozens and dozens of times, but I've never heard it called that. So I'm taking that. Thank you. But yeah, we call them bung inserts. And it's more of this single origin, 3 years cured, beautiful, breathtaking, delicate French oak. And we're just loading it into barrels. We do this with bourbon barrels as well. We'll add single origin French oak to a fantastic whiskey barrel. We call this the Wonder Bra approach because it lifts and separates the oak profile in such a way. Separates. You liked that, didn't you? I knew you were going to like that. Because we can make our own hybrid barrels like this, and it's still an extraction happening in a barrel. We're not just adding this oak to a stainless environment where we're just getting the extractive quality. We're still getting the oxidation. We're still getting the esterification. We're still getting the evaporation and concentration of everything. And also we're getting the extraction of this beautiful, lovely oak that you don't get to smell or taste unless you want to buy a $150 bottle of fucking Cabernet, and now you can have it in your English barley wine or your stout from Revolution Brewing in Chicago.
You guys don't have distribution in Kentucky, do you?
No, but don't tell them because I'm still going to expense most of this trip. Yeah, it's real close to Indiana, ain't it? Yeah.
Jessica, since we have these samples in front of us, these two side by side,
Yes.
can you walk us through this?
Yes. So I guess the one on the left.
That is.
You want to hand me
one
the
on the left. One on the left was yellow one.
Okay, yeah. So they're both. So it's MGP juice, and it was finished in our Moscatel cask. So Moscatel is from a region of Portugal. It's a muscat grape that they fortified, and fortified means you just add like an apple brandy to it or grape brandy to like stabilize it. I always love fortified. I sell a lot of wine casks, but I really love selling the fortified casks because they don't go bad. They don't get VA. They don't I can just ship them and they are good to go. So Doc Swinson's Washington MGP juice. The first one on the left is 3 to 4 weeks in a cask. It's 105.2 proof for educational purposes only. They did not release this. And then the one on the right is the final product. Also MGP 105.3 and aged in the Moscatel cask for 6 months. Okay, Kyle, you have a question?
So Andrew touched on oak alternatives as in other forms of oak, but I'd like to be curious about other alternatives other than oak. So we talk about oak a lot, which is technically a leggy. What about other types of wood, cherry wood, apple wood, anything like that? Just like anything else.
He's asking, I have to say this for the podcast, if you guys are experimenting with any other kinds of oak besides just like non-oaks. Non-oaks.
Me personally, I have tested over 45 different non-oak species. Well, I'm just saying, but there are some interesting ones, and there are some really, really kind of off ones. One of the things that I find fascinating with any kind of plant material is that a lot of the different things that you run into on a daily basis can come from these plant materials. And when you start to degrade these trees, not just oak, but when you start to degrade the lignin and the hemicellulose and you start to access some of the oils in there, they tend to be really familiar tastes. which makes them kind of pleasing and very, very interesting. But there also tends to be some bad. But me personally, we've tested about 45 to 55 different types of wood other than oak.
So the acacia barrels I have, that's a hardwood, not an oak, right?
It's not an oak. No, it's technically Amberana kind of falls within that category as well.
Because we have a winery that only used acacia, and they had like an excess of barrels, and so I had to ask you about it. And when I tried it, it was like it was cinnamon, not as like medicinal, not as harsh as Amberana. So I'm excited those are on the water to get those.
There's a lot of really good flavors out there. The only problem is that a lot of them really, really exotic flavors that actually taste really, really good. One of the easy ways you get a wood passed through to get approved for use, such as in beer or as in whiskey, is that it's already been used in a food application before. We studied a lot of different woods. 90% of them we'd have to run through the FDA to get used for approval. And it's just, anybody who's ever done it before, you have to go through the generally regarded as safe certification, and it's just a nightmare. You have to do all your own toxicology. You have to do a number of different things. It's kind of unfortunate because beyond oak, there are some really, really amazing flavors out there. There's a wood, and it costs about $200 for about that much of it. It's called snakewood, but it puts off some of the most amazing flavors that you could ever hear of. But unfortunately, nobody will get to use it because nobody will do the FDA process on it.
Yeah, that's been my experience as well. We're looking into a lot of Brazilian hardwoods, just being a minority in a very, very large blend because they're so flavor active. But the TTB, or Tax and Trade Bureau, won't allow us to use them unless they've seen spirit. And while it'd be very easy to just hold a half barrel of whiskey aside and put it into the barrel the day before you fill it and then empty it, you can only do that so long as a company is the size of Revolution before somebody does an audit and you get your butt handed to you from the regulators. But yeah, these exotic woods, we need them to be accessible for us to play with them. The restrictions are there from the TTB at least. So yeah, I would love to see more of that. But other than that, like cherry wood and stuff like that, Revolution's never played with it. I guess just for lack of opportunity or for motivation to go seeking it out, I haven't. But yeah, good question to ask.
On the consumer side, what's trending and what's kind of down?
On the consumer side, what's trending and what's down?
From my point of view, we work a lot with marketing teams for some of the bigger companies. And the question that seems to be consistent through all of them is how they make a more expensive product. So I would say that as far as my job goes, premiumization is probably kind of what is trending right now. More expensive stuff.
I would say for us, and seeing like just the new barrel, the wood, like Europe is really wanting like sustainability, like let's make wood sustainable. Let's have these certifications. And trying to get that in America is very difficult because it's a lot of money. And who does the cost fall on? Is it producers? Is it the cooperages? So going towards more sustainable and green, I would say, just from barrel perspective.
I think from a beer perspective, I don't know that barrel aging is trending, right? It was huge like 5-10 years ago, where you had, the Hunapoo days in Florida, and you had Dark Lord days and all of those things. I think there's been a little bit of a pivot in beer, right? People are getting into more mixed cultured sour programs, and there's all kinds of barrel applications for that. I think in Kentucky, we're benefiting for a resurgence of the experimentation that's happening in bourbon, right? You hear about Maker's 46 staves. Those things now there's all these proliferation of inserted staves that we can buy, right? So now we are the next innovators in how that imparts flavor into our beers, right? So we have beers now that we're like, well, it really wouldn't benefit from 6 months in a barrel or 12 months in a barrel, but it would benefit from finishing with some of the new products that are on the market, whether those are, second use cubes, second use staves. We recently took our Valentine's beer that we call Shot Through the Heart, which is a imperial milk stout that we never traditionally showed wood to, that we do with strawberries and cocoa nibs. And now that beer going forward, we had such a good success with it last year, sees the staves from Maker's 46 French oak barrels. So I think that there's a little bit, especially in this area, a little bit of a resurgence of some of the, not necessarily the barrel aging, but we're benefiting from the experiments that the bourbon producers are doing.
Kyle, you had a question?
Yeah. So I'm curious. Those of you that have put beer in barrels, beer is not as hardy as spirits for sure. Do you all have a top-up regimen to keep that barrel full of beer? And if so, what is your top-up regimen to produce oxidation?
Excellent question. In my experience, there's no right or wrong way. Oxidation is part of what happens to beer, and especially because beer is higher in sugar, oxidation plays a much larger role in the immediately perceptible aromatics, flavors, textures, and color of our product. So much of our color comes from just the oxidation of sugar and not the extract of barrel or char or anything else. A lot of the hallmarks of the homebrew days of a long time ago that people claim to know about. I'm sorry, what I set up the answer and then I forgot the question. What was it?
Topping off the barrel.
Topping off the barrels, yeah. So we allow some things just to go and achieve those fruity maltiness, and then I have an experimental stack in my inventory called the Barley Winery, where I'm topping off every 2 months in very young barrels because I'm trying to get as much extraction as possible, and I'm trying to limit the oxidation. I'm trying to limit the evaporation as much as possible. And I've got half of the lot in the Barley Winery, the other half of the lot just in the rest of the English stacks amongst the English, just kind of going kind of native, becoming what they've always become, straitjacket essentially, is our main barley wine. So we realize it, we appreciate it, and we are investigating what we can do to hopefully make a more compelling product with more extractive aromatics, qualities, textures, and less of the oxidative and less of that concentration of flavor, where it's more, just as balanced, just as nuanced, but it's with smaller flavors. It's a little bit gentler. So we do both, but we haven't released anything yet from the Barley Winery specifically. But stay tuned. Excellent question.
I'd say from a Gallant Fox perspective, we don't blend as much, obviously, right? We're a 10-barrel brewery, so when we do a barrel aged beer, we're not getting a ton of barrels. 53 gallons doesn't equate as a bourbon barrel volume. So when we blend, we're blending 2 or 3 barrels. So we've had to learn from our mistakes. We don't buy rum barrels anymore because of the leakiness of them. And the Cruzan rums barrel he talks about are actually young and very tight. So that's what we buy now. We don't buy top loaded bungs anymore because of how difficult it is with evaporation to get a bulldog, which is a tool that a brewery uses to push CO2 into a barrel to extract the beer from the barrel. Top loaded bungs, so barrels that set upright instead of sideways, tend to not get beer contact on the top of the barrel, which creates separation. And if you're letting a barrel set for 6 to 12 months, when you finally push the bulldog in and the CO2 in, the CO2 is leaking out the barrel top. It's not actually pushing your beer down. And then you have an issue with getting the beer out of the barrel. So we don't do any top ups. We do a lot of beeswax to keep our barrels as tight as possible. And we try to keep all of the barrels as much as we can clean, tight, because we know that we're going to have a very limited amount of beer for a blending perspective. So.
At least 2 hands.
I know.
Somebody shouting.
From a consumer standpoint, kind of what Muller was talking about earlier, it's a gentleman from Revolution.
Marty.
Marty.
What's your name?
Cameron.
What up, Cameron?
So my question, because because I feel like Revolution is so far ahead from a consumer standpoint that, large bottle formats are dead. We all know that from like a consumer standpoint, like 750s, you all kind of shifted your model from like 750s. I remember going to Chicago and buying like Destar and 750s, and now you're in cans. From like a reception standpoint, from like the consumers, how do you all feel like it's going with cans? And because from a barrel age standpoint in Kentucky, no one's really barrel aging stouts and stuff like that in cans right now.
Thank you for your support, and thank you for your support longitudinally. That's awesome. Appreciate it. We made the decision after we bought $1 million canning system that we would be a canning brewery. So while personally, romantically, I'd still like to see the Deepwood series in glass. It's an inert package, and as long as you have a good packaging system, that beer can develop, or at least it can maintain most of its born-on day quality. In a can, now with the California compliant non-BPA liners, I'm probably going to get a nasty gram from our marketing folks about this, but the cans don't hold up over time. You cannot put them in your closet for 3 years and have a better beer when you pull it out. You have to keep them cold, and you've got to drink them fresh. It's going well because the serving size is advantageous, because you don't have to wait until you have your 3 best friends over. As adults, how often are 3 best friends coming over to drink a bomber of big dumb English stout? At least for me, very rarely. But it's nice because a 12-ounce serving size is very advantageous for, fuck it, I've had a bad Tuesday, I'm going to have a goddamn beer that gets me drunk after 1, But if you hang on to it for a long time, the beer starts to get sad, doesn't it? You start to dissolve the can liner into the product. So I'd love to have a small, high-quality bottling line again, and maybe that's in the future sometime. For right now, Revolution's standpoint, or my line that I say is, we're going to do a better job next year. Don't age our fucking beer. Drink it now, keep it cold, enjoy it just because it's Wednesday. You don't need a special occasion to have a world-class beer. It's just beer. And next year's batch is going to be even better. So don't age it into perfection, because we've already tried that. It's just drink it now. But if you ever see, a social media poster or something like that says Revolution is going to fill 10-ounce glass bottles of Deepwood beers, just know that I'm going to be dancing my fucking dick off back home. Because that's what's best for the product longitudinally, and that's what most consumers are trying to do when they're buying a $40 4-pack of beer. Yeah, you can't blame them for hanging on to it, but a can just doesn't do it justice after about 6 to 10 months in most cases, depending on ABV, pH, sulfur content.
I think we have time for one more question. Did you still have that question?
Good question.
Not necessarily an aging question. I know it's not a very robust category. You guys have like a 4 or 5 year beer before? And why not?
I have. And I wasn't playing. I was fucking dead serious about it. We had a lot of barrel. Like when I say a lot, I mean like a batch of beer across a batch of barrels that were really leaking. This is about 11, 12 years ago. I think statute of limitations is going to forgive us here on this one. In Chicago, we're not surrounded by berry fields like you are in California, or hop fields like you are in Oregon and Washington. What we have is fucking cold winters. And ice beer, right? We had a couple of leaky barrels that showed lactobacillus infections. The lactobacillus showed up in the lab, but not in the sensory, because it was like a 14% English barley wine. The lacto was just barely hanging on in a petri dish or a PCR to show that its DNA was present. So we sequestered those barrels. And they were all leaking too. And I got sick and tired of mopping up after them. So I just put them outside. And then we had this phenomenon. I don't know if you've heard about it down here in Louisville or not, but it's called polar vortex, and it fucking sucks. it's like a visit from the North Pole. And we had 13, 14 consecutive days in, I'll call it 2014, don't quote me on it, of sub 30, like negative 30 ambient, never mind wind chill, negative 30 ambient temperatures. Those barrels just happened to go outside just to stop dripping inside during that time. And they stopped dripping. And there was all the snow on top of the barrels. And one day we had an open tank. I thought, well, shit, it's frozen. It's probably ice barley wine at this point. I'm going to rack it into a tank. And it frosted up all the cold of the beer, frosted up all the stainless on the tank, with no cooling on. And then we rebarreled that super fuck off cold beer into fresh rye barrels. I can't remember from where, I'm sorry. And then we re-aged that for another 6 months, brought it up to 18 ABV, ran that back through the lab. Lacto was pretty pissed off. It was gone. It was all dead. And then we sold that beer on draft.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, a word from our sponsors.
I'm not your sponsor, but I do want to thank you all for coming out. We're going to wrap this up right now so we can kind of mingle, eat some food, drink some drink, talk to some folks. But I do have one last sample for you all, and I don't know if you're familiar with the product Underberg, but they were kind enough to actually sponsor this event tonight for us. And another fun fact is that Underberg is barrel aged. People don't know that, but it is. And for that reason, we're going to pass some out. It's barrel aged. It's a Locking Oak, so it's going to be good. At least 8 generations of excellence here. So we're going to pass these Underbergs out and call it a night. Thank you all to our panelists, and thank you to our audience for being here tonight. We really appreciate you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ale Trail.